In June 2023, a grey government building in Karlstad released 600 pages that Swedish officials had spent years avoiding. The Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, known as MSB, published its findings on Islamist influence operations, naming study associations, mosques, and charities that had operated inside Sweden's welfare system for 3 decades. The report did not describe fringe actors. It described organizations that had received government money, sat on municipal advisory boards, and shaped curriculum in publicly funded schools. For a country that prides itself on transparency, the timing raised an uncomfortable question. If these networks had been building influence since the 1990s, why did it take until 2023 for Stockholm to formally investigate them? The answer begins with money. Ibn Rushd, Sweden's largest Muslim study association, had drawn over 100 million kronor annually from state education funds at its peak. Mosques across Gothenburg, Malmö, and Örebro had received support through the Swedish Commission for Government Support to Faith Communities, known as SST, for decades without serious audit. Researchers named in the MSB report, including terrorism scholar Magnus Ranstorp, had warned privately for years that some of these organizations maintained ties to the global Muslim Brotherhood movement through the Federation of Islamic Organizations in Europe. Yet no minister moved. No funding body pulled a grant. The machinery of Swedish civil society, built to support integration, had instead financed something officials struggled to even name. Politicians who once championed multicultural funding now faced television cameras asking why taxpayer money had subsidized parallel structures of religious authority. The report forced Sweden to reckon with a system it had trusted since the 1970s, a system built on the assumption that funding civil society meant funding democracy itself. That assumption was about to collapse. To understand how deeply embedded these networks became and why Swedish institutions were so slow to notice, you have to go back further than the refugee crisis, further than the riots, back to the founding logic of the Swedish welfare state itself, a model built on trust that nobody thought to verify. Sweden's system of funding civil society did not begin with Islam. It began in 1912 and matured through what Swedes call folkbildning, the tradition of popular education that by 1971 had become a cornerstone of the welfare state. Independent study associations, from labor unions to temperance societies to church groups, received government grants to organize adult education, cultural programs, and community outreach. The logic was simple. A strong civil society, funded generously and audited lightly, would strengthen democracy from below. Trust replaced bureaucracy. Oversight was minimal by design. In 1999, Sweden extended this model explicitly to religion. The Religious Communities Act created a formal channel for state support to mosques, churches, and synagogues alike, treating faith institutions as partners in the same welfare architecture that funded soccer clubs and choir societies. SST, the government body overseeing these grants, distributed millions of kronor annually with the same light touch used for folk-building associations. Officials saw funding a mosque as no different from funding a Lutheran congregation or a Pentecostal church. When large waves of immigration began reshaping Swedish cities in the 1990s and 2000s, this existing machinery absorbed Muslim organizations almost automatically. Ibn Rushd registered as a study association in 1998 and immediately qualified for the same generous, low-scrutiny funding that had supported Swedish civil society for a century. No new vetting process was created. No specific unit was assigned to track religious extremism within these grants. The assumption carried over unchanged: fund the institution, trust the outcome. For years, this worked exactly as intended for the vast majority of recipients, funding legitimate community centers, youth programs, and language classes. But the same system that avoided scrutinizing a Swedish choir society also avoided scrutinizing organizations with international religious political ties. Nobody in Stockholm's funding bureaucracy was equipped, or willing, to ask where an organization's ideology actually came from. That gap would soon be exploited by one network in particular, one that grew larger, richer, and more influential than any Muslim organization in Swedish history. By the early 2010s, Ibn Rushd Study Association had become the undisputed giant of Muslim civil society in Sweden, receiving well over 100 million kronor a year from the Swedish National Council of Adult Education, known as Folkbildningsrådet. Founded in 1998, it ran hundreds of local branches, funded youth camps, language courses, and lecture series stretching from Malmö to Umeå. On paper, it looked like a success story of state-supported integration. Underneath, researchers found a different architecture. Ibn Rushd's parent organization, the Islamic Association in Sweden, known by its Swedish initials IFIS, shared leadership, office space, and board members with organizations tied to the Federation of Islamic Organizations in Europe, a Brussels-based umbrella body that scholars, including Lorenzo Vadino and Magnus Ranstorp, identified as a European hub for the global Muslim Brotherhood movement. The overlaps were not incidental. Individuals sat simultaneously on the boards of Ibn Rushd, IFIS, and local mosque associations, moving funding and personnel between entities that state auditors treated as entirely separate. Grant applications to Folkbildningsrådet never asked about these connections, because Swedish funding law was built to evaluate educational activity, not ideological lineage. Meanwhile, similar patterns appeared in institutions like Romasäskolan, a Gothenburg school linked to the same network, and in mosque associations receiving SST support. Each organization, viewed individually, appeared to comply with Swedish regulations. Viewed together, they formed something researchers would later describe as a coordinated infrastructure, one designed to build long-term religious and political influence inside Swedish institutions using entirely legal, entirely state-subsidized channels. For over a decade, this network expanded largely unchallenged, protected less by conspiracy than by bureaucratic blind spots, and a political culture reluctant to question Muslim organizations too closely. That reluctance was not accidental either. It was rooted in specific fears about discrimination, specific gaps in interagency communication, and a specific history of Sweden looking away from uncomfortable questions about religion and power. To understand Sweden's decades of inaction, you have to understand what Swedish civil servants were actually afraid of. Since the 1990s, Sweden had positioned itself as a global model of tolerance, and officials in ministries and municipal offices carried a genuine, well-founded fear of stigmatizing a Muslim minority already facing housing discrimination, employment bias, and rising far-right rhetoric. Investigating Muslim organizations specifically, even when red flags appeared, risked headlines accusing the government of Islamophobia. Sweden's strong religious freedom protections compounded this caution. The instrument of government, part of Sweden's constitution, explicitly limits state interference in religious communities, and agency lawyers repeatedly advised that singling out Muslim organizations for financial audits could trigger legal challenges under freedom of religion statutes. The safer bureaucratic path was silence. But legal caution was only part of the story. The deeper failure was structural. Sweden's security service, SAPO, tracked violent extremism. Skolinspektionen, the school's inspectorate, evaluated curriculum and safety standards. Folkbildningsrådet and SST managed funding applications. Each agency operated in its own regulatory silo, built for a narrower purpose, and none had a mandate to trace ideological or financial connections across organizations. A mosque flagged by SAPO for extremist sermons might simultaneously receive a clean funding review from SST, because SST's mandate covered financial compliance, not theology. A school under scrutiny by Skolinspektionen for curriculum issues might share board members with a study association receiving millions from Folkbildningsrådet, and no database connected the two. Internal government reviews later confirmed this failure explicitly. No single office was ever tasked with connecting the dots between security warnings, educational oversight, and public funding streams. Officials at each agency later said, almost identically, that they assumed someone else was watching. Nobody was. This fragmented system might have persisted indefinitely had Sweden's demographic and political landscape not shifted dramatically, starting in 2015, when a historic wave of asylum seekers arrived, straining every institution meant to manage integration, and creating exactly the conditions Islamist-linked charities were positioned to exploit. In 2015, more than 160,000 asylum seekers arrived in Sweden, the largest per capita refugee intake in Europe that year. Swedish municipalities, overwhelmed and understaffed, leaned heavily on civil society organizations to handle housing referrals, language instruction, and community integration. Islamist-linked charities and study associations, already embedded in the funding system and possessing established networks of mosques, schools, and youth centers, stepped into that vacuum with remarkable speed. For overstretched local officials, groups like Ibn Rushd and affiliated mosque associations looked like willing, capable partners exactly when the state needed help most. Few asked deeper questions about ideology while refugee housing was in crisis. 2 years later, in 2017, riots broke out in the Stockholm suburbs of Rinkeby and Husby, following earlier unrest that had already drawn international headlines in 2013. Cars burned, police faced stones and fireworks, and commentators across Sweden debated failed immigration policy. Behind the scenes, Säpo, Sweden's security service, circulated internal warnings describing something more specific than street violence. The emergence of parallel religious authority structures in some immigrant-heavy neighborhoods, where informal religious councils and self-appointed community leaders, some tied to the same Brotherhood-linked networks researchers were tracking, exercised more practical authority over residents than Swedish municipal government did. These Säpo warnings reached ministry desks. They did not reach the public, and they did not trigger policy change. The government remained committed to the existing funding architecture, treating the riots as a symptom of economic exclusion rather than evidence of competing authority structures taking root. Folkbildning's Rådet continued disbursing grants to Ibn Rushd at nearly unchanged levels through 2018 and 2019. SST continued funding mosque associations flagged internally by Säpo. For 2 more years, warning signs accumulated in classified memos while public policy stayed frozen. It would take a change of government, a shift in parliamentary arithmetic, and one exhaustive academic investigation to finally force these warnings out of internal briefings and into Swedish law. In February 2021, the Swedish government handed Magnus Ranstorp a mandate few researchers had ever received: map the Muslim Brotherhood's actual footprint inside Sweden's civil society. Ranstorp, a terrorism scholar at the Swedish Defense University, had spent 2 decades studying jihadist networks abroad. Now he turned that lens inward, and what his team found filled a report exceeding 600 pages. 22 organizations, mosques, and schools appeared connected not by accident, but by shared boards, shared bank accounts, and shared ideology. Ibn Rushd sat at the center of the web. Ranstorp's researchers traced direct personnel overlaps between its national leadership and the Islamic Association in Sweden, and from there to the Federation of Islamic Organizations in Europe, the Brussels-based umbrella long identified by European intelligence services as a Brotherhood proxy. Financial records showed money moving from state grants into associations that then funded imams, textbooks, and youth camps promoting a political reading of Islam incompatible with liberal democracy. The report did not accuse Ibn Rushd of terrorism. Its conclusion was quieter and more damning. For over a decade, Swedish taxpayers had unknowingly financed a coordinated project to build religious political influence inside the country's own institutions, using the folkbildning system as its unwitting delivery mechanism. Ranstorp briefed ministers in closed sessions through 2022. Some officials called the findings exaggerated, arguing correlation between board members did not prove ideological coordination. Others, inside Säpo and the Migration Agency, said it confirmed what internal memos had suggested since 2017. The report landed in an already shifting political climate, 3 months before a national election that would hand unprecedented leverage to a party built on opposing exactly this kind of influence. Ranstorp himself warned that documentation alone would change nothing without new legal tools to act on it. Sweden had spent 30 years building a funding system designed to trust religious civil society without question. Now it had a 500-page catalog proving that trust had been engineered against it. The only question left was whether the next government would use the evidence or file it away like the warnings that came before. On September 11th, 2022, Sweden's election delivered a result the political establishment had spent years trying to prevent. The Sweden Democrats won 73 seats, becoming the second largest party in parliament and the largest within the emerging right-wing bloc. Ulf Kristersson's moderates could only form a government with their support, and that support came with conditions. Negotiations at Tidö Castle, 60 miles west of Stockholm, produced a 62-page agreement in October outlining sweeping policy demands, among them a direct response to the Ranstorp findings. Public funds must no longer flow to organizations that undermine democratic values or tolerate extremism within their ranks. For the first time, Sweden's welfare state model of religious funding faced a legal test it had never been built to pass. Throughout 2023, Parliament worked through amendments to the laws governing Folkbildningsrådet, the body overseeing study associations, and SST, the agency funding religious communities. The new provisions required recipients to actively demonstrate commitment to democratic principles, not merely avoid explicit violations. Grant reviews that had been largely procedural for decades became investigative. Folkbildningsrådet, which had dispersed over 3 billion kroner annually across Sweden's 10 national study associations, now had to justify continued funding to organizations named in Ranstorp's report. Critics inside Ibn Rushd called the changes political theater dressed as neutral policy, arguing the Sweden Democrats were using extremism concerns to target Muslim civil society broadly. Government ministers countered that the law applied equally to any organization, religious or secular, that failed the new democratic values test. By December 2023, the legal architecture was in place. Agencies that had spent 3 decades avoiding scrutiny of religious civil society now had explicit authority and explicit obligation to cut funding where extremism was documented. The reversal was almost total, from a system built on trust and non-interference to one demanding proof of democratic loyalty. What remained uncertain was how fast and how far agencies would actually use these new powers once budget season began. The numbers came fast once the law changed. In early 2024, Folkbildningsrådet announced it was cutting Ibn Rushd's annual grant by approximately 60%, from a peak that had once exceeded 100 million kroner down to a fraction of its former budget. The organization that had spent 25 years as Sweden's largest Muslim study association now faced an existential funding crisis within a single fiscal year. Ibn Rushd's leadership called the decision politically motivated and announced plans to appeal, arguing decades of educational programming for immigrant communities were being erased over guilt by association. Simultaneously, Skolinspektionen, the school's inspectorate, moved against Romoseskolan, a K-9 school in Gothenburg's Bergsjön district tied to the same network through shared board members and funding channels documented in Ranstorp's report. In March 2024, the inspectorate revoked the school's operating license, citing both the ideological affiliations and separate concerns about curriculum content that failed to meet national educational standards. Roughly 300 students were displaced mid-year, forcing families to scramble for alternative placements in a district already strained by school capacity. The closures rippled outward. Reactions split sharply along lines the government had hoped to avoid. Mainstream Muslim organizations, including several imams from Stockholm's larger mosques, publicly welcomed the crackdown, saying Brotherhood-linked networks had spent years distorting outside perception of Islam in Sweden while draining resources from genuinely community-focused charities. But those same leaders warned of a chilling effect spreading beyond its intended target. Smaller mosques and cultural associations with no documented extremist ties reported sudden funding delays and intensified audits as agencies, newly empowered and newly cautious, erred toward suspicion rather than risk another decade of inaction. Integration researchers began warning that Sweden risked overcorrecting, punishing ordinary Muslim civil society for the sins of a narrow, well-documented network. By mid-2024, the crackdown had visibly worked in isolating its primary target. Whether it had also planted new grievances in communities already navigating discrimination and suspicion remained an open and urgent question as the funding cuts rippled through neighborhoods far beyond Romoseskolan's shuttered classrooms. By late 2024, Swedish officials speaking on background admitted what the funding cuts and school closures could not undo. 30 years of institution building don't collapse because a grant shrinks by 60%. Ibn Rushd's network had trained a generation of youth leaders, staffed dozens of after-school programs, and embedded itself in the daily religious life of communities across Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö since 1998. Personnel moved fluidly between organizations even as specific entities lost funding, and the social trust built over decades did not evaporate with a parliamentary vote. Säpo's own 2024 assessment noted that while formal funding streams had narrowed, informal networks of influence, mosque leadership, youth mentorship, marriage counseling continued largely undisturbed, financed increasingly through private donations from Gulf-linked foundations that fell outside domestic regulatory reach entirely. For second-generation Swedish Muslims, the reckoning arrived as a double bind. Many had grown up attending Ibn Rushd programs or Roma Sesskolan classrooms with no awareness of board-level ties to Brussels-based federations or brotherhood ideology. They experienced the closures as sudden, disorienting, and stigmatizing. Community advocates pointed out that Sweden's own 30-year negligence, not Muslim civil society itself, had allowed extremist infrastructure to embed alongside legitimate community services so thoroughly that separating them now required surgery Sweden's institutions weren't equipped to perform cleanly. Meanwhile, the Sweden Democrats and allied commentators pointed to the Ranstorp report and funding cuts as vindication, evidence that years of warnings dismissed as xenophobic paranoia had been substantively correct. Both readings could be true simultaneously. The report that named 22 organizations, the law that empowered agencies to act, the grants that finally shrank, all arrived only after Ibn Rushd had already trained its leaders, built its schools, and shaped its constituencies across an entire generation. Sweden's folk-building model, built in 1971 on the assumption that state-funded civil society would always serve integration, never anticipated a network patient enough to exploit that trust for 3 decades. The legal tools now exist. The political will finally materialize. But infrastructure built across 30 years cannot be dismantled in 18 months of parliamentary amendments. Sweden acted, but decades too late.